The breaking of the color pie in Magic the Gathering has been a very controversial topic for a long time, especially more recently when Black has gained access to enchantment removal over the past couple of years, albeit at a price. A lot of folks have expressed their frustration around maybe even Blue gaining Vigilance or just other similar mechanics existing across the color pie without being able to mix. And I mean, the mixing of the color pie is how we get access to the 10 Ravnican guilds or the shards of Alara or the Khans of Tarkir. These different mixings of colors to gain access to different abilities and mechanics that certain decks and colors wouldn't have access to, and then the crossing of perfect mana bases or near perfect mana bases really allowing this all to sing. And this is kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Should we allow this type of color pie breaking? Is it ultimately okay, especially in standard legal sets? Should Black have access to enchantment removal? Should Izzet be allowed to play with Vigilance? And I mean, I'm hoping to address all of these, but I really want to get your thoughts down below, because the color pie breaking ultimately comes down to its player base. If players receive these cards well, use them, and express a lot of joy with these effects, then ultimately Wizards of the Coast is going to use them more. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Like, what are certain color pie breaks that you are a fan of, and what are certain ones that you never want to see? And let's just hop right into the topic at hand with Withering Torment, a card that for 3 you can destroy a creature or an enchantment and you lose 2 life. Now, in many ways, you can kind of see this card as on rate. It's an uncommon for 3 mana that destroys a creature. It's kind of like a Hero's Downfall, a Fall, or like Murder variant that we've seen across all standard formats. But the key is that it destroys an enchantment. And that's historically something that a lot of people would perceive Black to not be able to do, especially colors like red that are naturally good at destroying artifacts. Are, I mean, especially with the fact that artifacts are everywhere, especially when you think about Commander design with treasures being everywhere, everything making a treasure. Of course, a color pie that is a part of the color pie that is good at dealing with artifacts are going to be even more exacerbated. But Black having enchantment removal is a little weird, because historically Black has been able to deal with anything, especially with hand disruption. With something like Thoughtseize, Black is able to deal with essentially any single card at any single time whenever it wants, again with hand disruption. It's able to Thoughtseize something out. Inquisition is a little bit more restrictive. There are many other variants of hand disruption that you have access to in Black. And of course, there's ways to stop this with things like Hexproof and Shroud, but that's not like a card to card. That's an ability to a card that's stopping that type of effect. Again, Black is able to deal with anything. And in many similar ways, you could say that Blue is able to deal with anything with counter spells. But over time, we've gained access to cards that can't be countered, or cards with split second that don't allow you to react and things like that. So there's been counterplay over time, but in a vacuum sense, Black is able to deal with anything. But even in the color pie, you can see that Black's ideal, for many of you that don't know, is that Black is able to do anything but at a price. It's all about dark packs and bargains and tutoring for things at a cost of putting it on top of your life or losing a life or whatever it might be. There's a cost to the things that you want to do, but anything is at reach. And we see that kind of exemplified in the lore with the pacts that we see of demons and Liliana making pacts to save her brother's life and kind of really augment her own power. It's like we see this in the characters that we love. So why wouldn't Black be able to destroy enchantments? Again, it should be able to do anything. But the argument now is that Black is already able to do this again with the Thoughtseize effects and the hand disruption effects. It's in the non-traditional way, but in many other ways, Black is able to find anything. Black is the color of tutors and is very much so in constructed Magic and in Commander Magic and multiplayer Magic. Black is largely the color of tutors, and that's why it's being played. And then obviously you have your big haymakers and everything. But why shouldn't Black have access to enchantment removal? I mean, the big precedent was set, I mean, years ago with a card like Feed the Swarm primarily being the big showcase piece. You lose a fair amount of life for it, but again, the destroy target creature or destroy target enchantment at 1 less than something like Withering Torment. Withering Torment being 1 more colorless, but at instant speed, which I think a lot of people would argue is much better. Even though it's 1 more cost, you're kind of past that 1 versus 2 mana cost. The 2 versus 3 mana cost comparison is a lot less in terms of 1 versus 2. So a lot of people would like to trade off that instant speed for that 1 more cost. And that really kind of had brought about this whole discussion around color pie breaks. But these things have existed for a very long time. Blue has access to single target removal. Blue has access to, heck, burn in the older Magic sets, and you could name a counterspell in every single color. I mean, take a look at cards like Lapse of Memory, which exists in white as a white counterspell. You have Tybalt's Trickery in red. You have Dash Hopes in black, and I mean, don't even get me started with green. Green actually has a fair amount. I'm not going to name Veil of Summer. What about something like Emerald Dragon that has an alternate cost of, you know, it is a creature, but you have the ability to counter like an activated or triggered ability. Like, all this exists in Magic the Gathering. And although I will say that is a bit of a cherry-picked example, I'm not saying that like red has like insanely good, efficient, multiple options of enchantment removal. Chaos Warp is really like the one thing that a lot of mono red players go to, especially in Commander, but that's okay. Colors are allowed to have weaknesses to them. And Mark Rosewater has gone on record to talk about, you know, colors having secondary or tertiary abilities to, you know, have certain mechanics or deal with certain things. I mean, MTG Insider recently posted this tweet about how Izzet has suddenly had access to Vigilance, and talking about how blue is kind of like this like secondary or tertiary color that now has access to Vigilance, and by proxy Izzet would as well. But it kind of feels, again, more breaking because that doesn't feel like something that red should have access to. So even though blue has access to Vigilance based on kind of lore and intellect and wisdom, should that type of patience and wisdom be attached to the chaotic intellectual of Izzet mages? Is that something that Vigilance should be attached to? And Vigilance exists primarily in white, a little bit in green, but again, should Vigilance exist in Izzet? It's not just about blue, because once you start mixing multiple colors together, that's when the lines really start to blur in a weird way. Like 3 color combinations and 4 color combinations are really interesting spaces to explore. And I think like the Cons blocks and, you know, the Shards of Alara sets have done really interesting jobs of doing so, because you have cards that are like, you know, the Shard Charms and like the Guild Charms that kind of mix and meld some of these in terms of optionality, which I think are like very different, because you choose one. It's not that you have a creature that's Izzet that has Storm, Haste, Vigilance, and Flying, right? Like the ultimate Stormcrow variant. You don't have cards like this, but you have a card that maybe makes a token and you choose one. Maybe you have like an Izzet Charm variant that makes a 1/1 goblin with haste or a 1/1 bird with flying, right? Like that would be the way you separate it in terms of the charm. So it's not really that true mixing that you're necessarily looking for. So where does all of this land in terms of the color pie breaks? Does it mean that we should silo off these effects in the color pie so that different colors don't have access to things, and we stick true to what it means to mix these colors? We should stick to the guilds. If white want access to haste, they should be playing in Boros. If blue wants access to enchantment removal, they should be playing with something like white in Azorius. Like, is this the only way that we should allow colors to interact? And I would largely argue no. I think the colors should have access to do anything, but again, at a cost. It should be kind of mixed and matched with the lore and the kind of ideals of that color. That should make sense. Blue should be able to deal with any permanent, but it's a bounce effect, so your opponent is able to re-interact with it, and I mean they already do so with counter spells. Black should be able to do so as well, but maybe at a higher spell cost. The spell that you have access to costs more in terms of physical mana and as well as resources in your life. It should cost something like that to, as we already see, to draw cards. We've seen plenty of draw effects that you draw 2 cards, draw 3 cards, and you lose life equal to the amount of cards that you've drawn or a similar amount. So that already exists. Again, there is a cost associated to it. And maybe green should be able to deal with artifacts and enchantments and creatures pretty well, but it does so in a very very costly way, where you require a board where you have to tap down creatures and then destroy artifacts or enchantments equal to the amount of creatures that you tap down. Or you're able to remove creatures pretty well like black, but you have to use one of your creatures to fight another creature. Like, all these things are available 2 different colors. And maybe white might be seen as more siloed effects, where you might see white being able to deal with all this stuff in like the form of board wipes, where you have the farewell effects and the Wrath of God effects. Like, yeah, you have creature removal, but it's more like very single target, very kind of niche picks, like it has to be exile. It may not be a lot of destroy effects, or it's just kind of board wiping everything and just getting rid of everything that you see. on the battlefield. And so again, naming off multiple different ways that I believe the color pie should be able to deal with different options, but again, at a cost. It shouldn't be a new thing that the color pie is being introduced to new quote unquote new mechanics or ways to deal with anything. It's not necessarily color pie breaking, but when we bring it into the lens of a specific piece being introduced, I think that's where people get upset. It feels weird that when it comes to removal, something like enchantment, that the color pie and its association with mechanics are very removal heavy. It feels weird when red is now able to deal with like big creature. It feels weird when red has a card that says destroy target creature. That'd be very weird because red's form of removal is damage based, but that seems to be where the whole conversation really lines up, right? When is the last time you had a conversation with someone around color pie breaks that isn't centered around removal? When is the last time you had a conversation with someone around a creature that quote unquote breaks the color pie? It doesn't really happen too often, although in conversation it doesn't. It, I would argue, happens a lot in terms of design. It feels like a lot of creatures do a lot of things these days, and that's the whole kind of word soup that we see, the word creep that we see in Magic the Gathering, and then alternatively, Wizards of the Coast attempt to shorten the amount of words on cards. Like, we don't have enters the battlefield anymore, we have enters now. And so things like this serve to kind of give and take in terms of Magic's design. When they provide us with more abilities on these creatures and on our cards, but take away some of the words to help shorten things, it helps with an understanding perspective, but also gives Wizards of the Coast more space to be able to clearly provide mechanics and abilities on our cards instead of everything looking like a Yu-Gi-Oh card, like a cramped little text box that you can't even read, so we become like an anime TCG. We don't want that. But what we do want, again, is all of our cards to be able to do things, again, at a cost, to be able to synergize with some of the ideals of the colors that we have, but also have these color pie break conversations that lead to something ideal outside of removal. Right? It's not just about blue having counter spells and black having like Thoughtseize effects and white just being able to like have Path to Exile and I don't know, whatever, right? Like, you get the point. I guess green having like fight effects. That's another way I could say that. But the conversation can't just be centered around removal. It's not just about white's ability to be able to have counter spells, but oh yeah, it has board wipes and it has like single target removal, but it's like big bomb effects aren't really that great. Like, white is seen as such a weak color, quote unquote, because it has the ability to do so many things, but it doesn't do so in a very concerted way or have like very powerful effects. Like, it isn't really the color seen as one with tutors, although there are some powerful tutors in white. It isn't the color seen as like maybe like powerful commander effects or like card draw, but it does have card draw effects and tutor effects. It is able to tutor for lands and ramp for lands, especially in commander, but it really only does so when it's behind. Again, ability to do anything, but at a cost. A pretty good design, and heck, even that ramp that white's able to do, it's usually specifically centered around grabbing planes. It's not around grabbing any type of land. Again, it's usually around centering the ability to grab planes, but when you're behind on lands. Like, all of these things exist. The color pie has already been broken. It's just making sure that we design around the parameters that we've set, right? We shouldn't just be able to have cancel in, literally red 1 cancel. We shouldn't just be able to have like hard counter spells, 1-to-1 effects. Everything should exist in the color pie. You should be able to do anything you want, but in a way that lines up with what the ideals of that specific color are. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. This became a bit of like a ranty kind of blurby type of video, and I just want to get some thoughts across here. I think Magic, largely speaking, is designed really well, and I welcome these rare effects that people are paying attention to. And I hope that the conversation centers away from the whole removal aspect of things, that we look at the design of creatures, that we look at the design of permanents in general, and how they can break the color pie as well, because it's never really a center of conversation. It's usually when the color pie is broken in those colors, it's like a broken planeswalker or a broken enchantment in blue or something. Like, it's always stuff like that that people talk about. They don't talk about the individual nuances of stuff like this. It's always like, wow, black is a 1-mana removal that can deal with anything. That breaks the color pie because now it deals with enchantments or artifacts or whatever. Let's shift our conversation. Let's talk about design at whole, and maybe stop focusing on the fact that black has gained access to something that honestly it should have had access to for a very long time.